Stress response is an important biological advantage that a lot of animals and humans have that have given us the ability to respond to stressful situations appropriately. So, something like 10,000 years ago, a hunter is hunting and it sees a saber-toothed tiger and it is able to recognize that this is a stressful situation and it should use its fight or flight response to get out of there. There are a lot of brain structures and chemicals that are involved in these stress responses, which we will discuss today. And lately, the stress response, as people have focused more on something like anxiety disorder. So if you have panic disorder, you would have some sort of stressor that causes you to have an irrational stress response, which can lead to a panic attack. So something like that could be, could be driving to work causes this irrational fear. There's something that, like the stressor is driving to work, which causes this pathway to be overactive and causes you to have these panic attacks, which can be pretty scary. They last about 30 minutes, but people will have them. Definitely need psychiatric help. And so we're going to discuss some of these pathways and what can go wrong with them today. So we're going to discuss the humoral response, which is mediated by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So that's a mouthful. I'm going to write that down right here. So hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And we're just going to refer to it as HPA. So this is mediated by, so the stress response is mediated by the HPA as cortisol, also known as glucocorticoid, is released from the adrenal cortex in response to increased level of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which I will also write down here, and then we'll abbreviate that as ACTH. So adrenocorticotropic, so this mediates because of release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH. So this is released by the anterior pituitary gland in responses to levels of corticotropic releasing hormones. So we'll write that down as well. And so right here we have the corticotropin. Releasing hormone. So these are the various chemicals that are involved in the release. So we'll abbreviate this as well as CRH. Okay, so those are the pathways. So this corticotropin releasing hormone is released in the blood by the parvocellular neurosecretory neurons in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is obviously really involved in this pathway. So next we're going to talk about the regulation of the HPA axis. So regulation of this is done by the amygdala and the hippocampus. So I'm going to draw this diagram here. So we have the amygdala and we'll do this in a different color. Here, and then down here we're going to have the HPA. Okay, so we will do this in blue, and we're going to do this in red. Okay, so the amygdala is critical to fear responses, so you might associate the amygdala as being this fear response part of the brain. So as sensory information enters the basolateral amygdala, where it's processed and relayed to neurons in the central nucleus. So when the central nucleus becomes active, the stress response ensues. So in panic disorders, inappropriate activation of this amygdala central nucleus would cause activation of the HPA pathway, which will trigger a release in cortisol. And the HPA pathway is also regulated by the hippocampus. So if this right here is a positive feedback, so it is making the HPA release cortisol, the hippocampus actually acts as a suppressor. So it doesn't stimulate the CRH release by HPA, which is right here. It suppresses it. So this would be a negative, draw a circle around it, and this is the positive. So as the hippocampus contains what are called glucocorticoid receptors. So I'm not going to write that down because it's not really relevant to this video, but the glucocorticoid receptors respond to the cortical released from the adrenal gland in response to HPA system activation. So it kind of acts as a feedback loop. So if this comes up here and will bind to these receptors, the glucocorticoid receptors, so I guess I will write it down. Glucocorticoid receptors. So it responds to the release of the cortisol from the adrenal gland in response to activation of this HPA system. So it will usually inhibit it. So the amygdala and the hippocampus act as kind of like a push-pull. So the amygdala will activate it and the hippocampus will actually inhibit it. Too much release of cortisol. So too much release of cortisol will actually cause the hippocampal neurons to wither and die. So that obviously causes this negative feedback, so the inhibition of the HPA activation to slow down. So this is when the amygdala can be overactive, which can lead to these panic disorders. So the volume of the hippocampus has actually shown a decrease in people who have something like PTSD, which is another panic disorder based on stressors. So the hippocampus will actually be a smaller volume. So in summary, the amygdala and the hippocampus regulate this HPA axis and stress response in a push-pull fashion. So the anxiety disorders that have been related to both hyperactivity of the amygdala and diminished activity of the hippocampus. So that's basically how this pathway can actually affect these panic disorders.